And we had orders to get the lifeboats out. And because the order, the same old order, women and children. And we swung the lifeboats out and gradually filled them up. First boats were on the port side.
In 1912, a forgotten box sat in Titanic archives for over 100 years. Inside was a lifeboat manifest that nobody had really studied. When experts finally zoomed in, they went pale. This wasn't just a list of survivors. Strange markings appeared next to names. Some were crossed out. Others had mysterious symbols. One name had a small X beside it. Historians now believe that person was found frozen in an upside-down lifeboat days later. But the most shocking discovery wasn't about who survived. It was about the empty seats that floated away in the darkness. But to really understand why this piece of paper terrified experts, we have to go back to the very beginning, before the Titanic even left port. The Titanic set sail from Southampton on April 10, 1912. She was the largest ship in the world and called unsinkable by almost everyone. Over 2,223 people were on board, including passengers, crew, and officers. But there was one thing missing: enough lifeboats. Titanic carried only 20 of them. 14 were the regular wooden kind, 2 were small emergency cutters, and 4 were collapsible canvas boats. Altogether, if filled to the brim, they could hold 1,178 people. That wasn't even close to the number of people on the ship. In fact, it was only enough for about 53% of everyone aboard. That meant nearly half the people had no chance of getting a seat, even in the best case. But it gets worse. On the night Titanic sank, 472 of those lifeboat seats went unused. They were empty. Hundreds of people died while space floated away in the darkness. Why would such a huge and modern ship carry so few lifeboats? The answer shocked even experienced historians. It was legal. Back then, the law didn't require ships to have lifeboats for everyone. The rules were based on a ship's weight, not how many people were on it. Titanic actually had more lifeboats than required. The original design planned for 48 boats, but that number was cut to just 20 because more boats would have cluttered the elegant open decks. The builders and owners believed Titanic would float long enough for help to arrive, even in the worst disaster. Captain Edward Smith once said, "I cannot imagine any condition that would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." He truly believed it. But on April 14, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., Titanic struck an iceberg. Just minutes later, cold water was rushing in. Within hours, she would break apart and vanish beneath the sea. By the time the crew realized the ship was going to sink, it was already too late to save everyone. Orders were given to uncover the lifeboats and start evacuating. It was just past midnight on April 15th. Officers tried to stay calm, but confusion spread quickly. 2 officers were in charge of loading passengers. First Officer William Murdoch on the starboard side, and Second Officer Charles Littler on the port side. They both followed the rule of women and children first, but in different ways. Murdoch allowed some men to board if no women were nearby. Littler refused men completely, even if there was space left in the boat. That difference changed the lives of many people that night. Passengers were scared and confused. When the iceberg hit, many had only felt a small vibration. The ship still looked fine. The lights were on. Music was playing. It didn't seem urgent. Getting into a tiny boat hanging 70 or 80 feet above a freezing black ocean seemed more dangerous than staying put. As a result, some lifeboats were launched nearly empty. Lifeboat 7 was the first one lowered, around 12:40 a.m. It could hold 65 people. Only 28 were on board. That kind of mistake happened again and again. Lifeboat 6 left with only 24 people. That one carried Margaret Brown, the Denver millionaire later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. She had to be physically picked up and placed inside by crew. One man was allowed in that boat, Major Arthur Puchin, because he had sailing experience and offered to help row. Rules were so strict that even boys were sometimes turned away. One 11-year-old first-class boy, William Carter Jr., was refused entry until his mother placed a woman's hat on his head to disguise him. The line between childhood and adulthood was blurred in the panic. There were stories of fathers holding their families tight, only to watch their wives and children be pulled away into lifeboats while they stood behind with no chance of survival. The pain was unbearable, and the clock was ticking. Rockets were fired into the sky, begging for help. Distress signals were sent out over the radio. Still, people hesitated. Many didn't realize the ship was truly sinking until it tilted sharply and water reached the decks. Even then, they clung to hope. Some crew begged passengers to board, but many refused. They believed the Titanic was still safer. One sailor watched a half-empty lifeboat lower into the sea and quietly said, "If they are sending the boats away, they might as well put some people in them." His words hit hard because they came true. Hundreds of people were still standing on deck when the last boats left. Some waved goodbye. Some jumped. Most never had a chance. Experts now believe Titanic had enough time to save almost everyone. She stayed afloat for about 2.5 hours after hitting the iceberg. That was enough time to fill every lifeboat, lower them safely, and send them back for more. But it didn't happen. The belief that the ship couldn't sink caused people to hesitate. Poor planning and different interpretations of the rules made things worse. The final result was disaster. Now, more than a century later, that lifeboat manifest tells the full story in black and white. It lists names of those who survived, but also shows who was kept out, who got in early, who was left behind. There are strange notes beside some names, like a question mark or a line through the paper. One name had a small X beside it. Historians now think that person was pulled from a lifeboat, later found floating with several frozen bodies inside. That boat, called Collapsible B, was discovered days later with no oars, flipped upside down, carrying several corpses, including First Officer William Murdoch's brother, James Moody. Others clung to its sides until rescue, but many were too cold to survive. That lifeboat had been launched last and not properly secured. It drifted for hours. Even though officers kept shouting for women and children first, many of the Titanic's lifeboats were lowered with only a few people inside. Some were barely half full. This didn't happen by accident. Some officers were afraid the ropes or the boats might break if they filled them too much. So they decided to be cautious and sent them down with fewer people than they could hold. But fear wasn't the only reason. A lot of passengers were scared to get in. The idea of being lowered almost 90 feet in the dark, over freezing water, in a small wooden boat didn't feel safer than staying on the huge Titanic, which still seemed solid beneath their feet. Some women didn't want to leave their husbands behind. Some people from lower decks didn't even realize how serious the danger was until it was too late. Because of all this, lifeboats left with far fewer people than they were made to carry. Official reports later confirmed this. The timeline that night says everything. At 12:40 a.m., Lifeboat 7 was the first one lowered. It was on the starboard side and had only about 28 people inside, even though it could hold 65. Many seats were empty because most people didn't believe yet that the ship was really sinking. 5 minutes later at 12:45, Lifeboat 5 was lowered. also on the starboard side. It had about 35 people, still not full. At 12:55, Lifeboat 6 left from the port side with just around 24 people. Almost all were women and a few crew members. The officer in charge, Lightoller, struggled to find women willing to go. Only one man was allowed in, and that was Pushin, who helped row. By 1 a.m., 2 more boats went down. Lifeboat 3 had around 32 people, and Lifeboat 8 had about 39. Both were below capacity. Then, at 1:10 a.m., Lifeboat 1 left the starboard side with only 12 people on board. It had space for 40. This became one of the most talked about boats later. There were 5 first-class passengers and 7 crew inside. That meant 28 seats were left empty in the middle of a disaster. Between 1:20 and 1:30, more boats went down in quick order. Lifeboat 16, 14, 12 on the port side, and lifeboats 9 and 11 on the starboard side. These were a bit more filled, around 40 to 50 people each. By then, the bow of Titanic was lower in the water, and people began to panic as they saw the ship tilting. At 1:40 a.m., lifeboats 13 and 15 were lowered very close together. There was a terrifying moment when Lifeboat 15 almost crushed Lifeboat 13 below it. A strong water discharge had pulled Boat 13 under the path of Boat 15. At the last second, some crew members cut the ropes using pocket knives, saving everyone. Boat 15 had about 55 people. Boat 13 had around 64. At 1:45, Lifeboat 2 went down on the port side with only about 25 people, even though it could hold 40. Then at 1:55 a.m., Lifeboat 4 finally got away. It had been delayed because it was waiting at a door for first-class women to come up. It left with around 30 to 35 people. A few survivors were pulled from the sea and added later. By 2 a.m., all the wooden lifeboats were gone. The only ones left were the collapsibles. These were special boats with canvas sides and were stored flat. The crew rushed to open and launch them as the bow sank deeper. Collapsible C was successfully launched from the starboard side right at 2 a.m., just as water started pouring over the deck. It had around 43 people, including J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line. He stepped in at the last second when no one else was around. At 2:05, Collapsible D was launched from the port side. It left with about 25 people, mostly women. Lightoller helped get them aboard. Witnesses said, as D went down, water was already covering the ship's bridge deck. People were rushing toward the back of the ship, trying to stay above water. The last 2 collapsible boats, A and B, never got launched properly. Titanic gave a final shake. Her lights flickered, and the ship broke apart. Boat B flipped and floated away upside down. Boat A was swept off the deck, upright but full of water. People jumped into the freezing ocean and tried to climb onto these rafts as their last hope. Titanic's final moment came around 2:20 a.m., when she broke apart and disappeared beneath the waves, taking over 1,500 souls with her. Some lifeboats witnessed things that still make people shiver today. Lifeboat 1, launched at 1:10 with just 12 people, became infamous. It had Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, his wife Lady Lucy Duff Gordon, her secretary, and 7 crewmen. Sir Cosmo had simply asked if his group could board, and Officer Murdoch allowed it. No one else was added. After Titanic sank, those in the boat heard the cries of hundreds in the water, but no one rowed back. Fireman Charles Hendrickson said he begged them to return and help. He shouted, "It's up to us to go back and pick up anyone in the water." But nobody agreed. Later that night, Lady Duff Gordon said how sad she was about losing her nightgown and belongings. A crewman replied that they all had lost their gear, and their pay would stop now. Sir Cosmo said, "Very well, I will give you a $5 each to start a new kit." He gave each of the 7 crew members $5 when they reached the rescue ship Carpathia. Newspapers later accused him of bribing the crew not to go back. The British inquiry looked into it and cleared him, accepting that it was a gift, not a payoff. But public opinion didn't forgive him. A photo later showed Lifeboat 1's passengers smiling in life jackets on the Carpathia's deck. Survivors who had lost family found that deeply offensive. People began calling Lifeboat 1 the money boat. In Lifeboat 6, things were different. It was mostly women and was commanded by Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, who had been steering Titanic when it hit the iceberg. He refused to go back for survivors. When people asked him to turn around, he said, "No use going back. There's only a lot of stiffs out there. It's our lives now, not theirs." He told the rowers to stop rowing. One woman got angry and reminded him, "Don't you know you're talking to a lady?" Another woman, Molly Brown, didn't back down. She told him to be quiet, or she'd throw him overboard. Then she took an oar herself and got the women to row in shifts to stay warm and keep moving. Her courage and leadership helped everyone stay alive. Later, newspapers called her the unsinkable Molly Brown. Her lifeboat finally reached the Carpathia around 8:01 a.m. That boat also carried a small dog, a Pomeranian. The dog's owner, Elizabeth Rothschild, refused to leave it behind. In total, 3 dogs survived the Titanic's sinking. The fact that more dogs survived than many people is still hard to accept. One lifeboat did return. Lifeboat 14 was led by 5th Officer Harold Lowe. His boat left around 1:30 a.m. with 40 people. As it was lowered, a large crowd tried to rush toward it. To stop them, Lowe fired 3 shots into the air. That warning saved the boat from being overwhelmed. Once clear, Lowe didn't just drift away. After the Titanic sank, he moved passengers to other lifeboats to lighten his own. Then he turned back to look for survivors. He was the only officer to return to the wreck site. By the time he got there, the ocean was nearly silent. Most people had already died from the cold. Still, Lowe pulled 4 people from the water. 3 died shortly after. Only one survived, a young Chinese man named Fang Lang, who had been clinging to floating wood. When Lowe was asked later why more boats didn't go back, people gave reasons like fear of being pulled under, or not realizing how bad it really was. But Lowe said at the U.S. inquiry that he was only there for life, to save life, and not to bother about bodies. He left 3 bodies behind in another lifeboat, but focused on those still breathing. There were even stories of men pretending to be women to get into lifeboats. Lowe once found a man wearing a shawl, trying to pass as a female passenger. He tore the shawl off and threw him into another boat. That man was later identified as Edward Ryan, an Irish third-class passenger. He admitted later in a letter that he'd thrown a towel over his head to sneak into a boat. Another man, Daniel Buckley, was helped by a kind woman who covered him with a shawl to save him. There was huge public pressure on men to give up their spots. One man, William Sloper, was wrongly accused by newspapers of dressing as a woman. He had not. An officer had allowed him on Lifeboat 7, but the press attacked him just because he survived. He almost sued for libel. By the end, the very last lifeboat to be launched was Collapsible D. Lightoller and Chief Officer Henry Wild helped load it. Around 25 people got in, mostly women. But by that time, men started to panic and push forward. Lightoller had to pull his gun to hold them back. He didn't shoot, but the warning was clear. Collapsible D left at 2:05 a.m., minutes before the ship went under. Lightoller himself was washed into the sea. He clung to the overturned Collapsible B and managed to survive. In the freezing darkness of April 15, 1912, Silence covered the sea where Titanic had vanished just after 2:20 in the morning. Only the sound of waves hitting wood and the quiet sobs of survivors filled the night. Then, a faint light appeared on the horizon. Someone in one of the lifeboats shouted. It was a rocket. And behind that rocket, racing full speed through ice-choked waters, was the RMS Carpathia. Captain Arthur Rostron had received Titanic's distress signal at 12:25 a.m. He didn't hesitate. He ordered all power redirected to the engines, extra lookouts posted, and prayer services held for protection. His ship pushed through the night, dodging icebergs and racing over 58 miles to get to the coordinates Titanic had given before it sank. Carpathia arrived just after 4 in the morning. There was no Titanic, just wreckage floating in the black water, and tiny specks of light from the lifeboats scattered across the waves. At 4:10 a.m., they reached the first lifeboat. It was Lifeboat 2. Inside were cold, exhausted women and children from one of the emergency cutters. Crew and passengers on Carpathia had already turned their ship into a floating hospital. They carried hot drinks, blankets, bandages, and comforting words. Over the next 4 hours, lifeboat after lifeboat came alongside. Some had only a few people, others were overcrowded. Carpathia picked up survivors non-stop until 8:15 a.m., when they reached Lifeboat 12, which had taken on extra passengers during the night. There were about 70 people crammed into it, including Second Officer Charles Lightoller, the highest-ranking officer to survive. By the time the last soul was pulled aboard, the final count stood at 706 survivors. That meant over 1,500 people had died. Among those saved, the majority were women and children, and most were from first and second class. Captain Rostron held a brief funeral service at sea. 4 people who had been rescued died soon after from exposure or injuries. They were buried at sea that same day. Then Rostron gave the quiet order: set course for New York. It was Titanic's intended destination, but now Carpathia carried the weight of grief and shock instead of hope and dreams. Of Titanic's 20 lifeboats, 13 were brought aboard and taken to New York. The rest were left floating because there wasn't enough space on Carpathia's deck. Collapsible B was found empty later. Collapsible A was also recovered later, waterlogged and carrying bodies. The wooden lifeboats that reached New York were the only remaining parts of Titanic still afloat. White Star Line saw them as valuable property. When Carpathia docked at Pier 59 on April 18th, they were offloaded quietly, stained, battered, and filled with the invisible weight of what had happened. But something else came with those boats: the Lifeboat Manifest. When the Titanic survivors disembarked, New York was waiting for them. Reporters swarmed the docks. Thousands of people stood behind barricades. The world wanted answers. The United States Bureau of Immigration needed names. Carpathia's officers, with help from Titanic's surviving crew, created a passenger manifest. But this wasn't a normal list. These weren't Carpathia's passengers. They were people who had just escaped death. The manifest recorded all 706 rescued souls. Name, age, gender, marital status, last place of residence, and destination were written down as if they had been regular travelers on Carpathia. But this was no ordinary list. It was grouped loosely by lifeboat. You could read name after name and realize they came from the same boat. Neighbors in survival. Some names had marks beside them. A symbol, a cross, a note like injured or died after rescue. One entry said DOA, dead on arrival. That man had survived the sinking and made it into a lifeboat, but died before reaching land. Historians later traced this to a third-class male pulled from the water who had likely fallen into icy water and never fully recovered. His body was buried at sea from Carpathia, yet his name was on the manifest. This made the document even more haunting. It recorded not just the living, but those death tried to take more than once. As researchers zoomed in on this document years later, they began to realize how much it revealed about that night. Out of all first-class passengers, only 39% died. In second class, 58% were lost. But in third class, the number was horrifying. 76% died. When it came to gender, the divide was even more painful. About 80% of all men aboard Titanic perished. Among women, only 25% died. This reflected the women and children first rule, but also something else. Many third-class women and children never reached the lifeboats. Barriers, locked doors, and language issues slowed them down. Whole families were trapped below decks, while lifeboats were being lowered. The manifest told those stories in silence. One section showed a mother with 2 children. The father's name was missing. He had stayed behind, likely waving goodbye. Another section listed a nurse and her patient, both rescued. Nearby was the name of a steward who had helped others before jumping into a boat at the last moment. Around 212 crew members survived. That means out of roughly 892 crew, more than 75% died doing their jobs. Their names appeared in the same list as the millionaires and immigrants, all rescued, all human. One page showed a group of names with barely readable handwriting. At the end of that group was a child's name, followed by a blank space. That child had made it. Her parents hadn't. Out of 79 children in third class, 52 died. That meant only 27 children from third class survived. In first and second class, nearly every child lived. These numbers weren't just statistics. They were quiet screams hidden between the ink and the margins. Experts who studied the manifest decades later couldn't hide their emotions. One historian said, "When I saw that child's name next to a blank spot, I had to walk away." Another noted that seeing entire families broken apart by a line of ink made it real in a way no photo ever could. The manifest wasn't just a record. It was a list of souls, a ledger of fate. White Star Line kept the document preserved. For years, it sat in archives, almost forgotten. But when it was digitized and studied in detail, people began to see patterns they hadn't noticed before. A woman marked as single was actually a newlywed whose husband died in Lifeboat 1. A man listed as surviving was later found to have died from pneumonia just days later. He had made it through the wreck, but couldn't survive the trauma. Even small notes like "mother grieving" or "refused food" painted pictures of human suffering. The manifest also gave hints of the social order even in death. Some names were marked as saloon passenger, while others were listed with no class at all, just steerage. First-class survivors were given cabins on Carpathia. Third-class survivors slept on blankets in hallways. Some never spoke again about what they saw. Others gave interviews that helped the world understand what happened. But the truth was, right there on the pages. Who made it? Who didn't? Who was saved and still didn't survive? This one list, created in the chaotic days after Titanic's sinking, became a mirror to the disaster. It showed the inequality, the heroism, the loss, and the randomness of fate. No one expected a simple government document to hold so much emotion. But when you read it slowly, you realize that every name once had a heartbeat. Every blank space once had a dream behind it. And every mark beside a name meant someone noticed, someone remembered.